it is still 5 p.m. and we will get started with our work.
And I'm guilty of forgetting the microphone this time. We have one item on our agenda tonight. That's review and discussion of our tax abatement policy with Laura Smith, Pete Heaven, and Kevin Wimpy.
Yes, and we're going to trade this gigantic microphone here out.
It's okay. It's a good reminder since I forgot about the mic.
Okay, much better. Celia's tall enough to do the long microphone. I can't do the long one. I have to do the short one. As the mayor said, what we wanted to do this evening in a work session was just kind of talk about potential revisions to the city's policy on tax abatement. As you all know, we currently are at least in conversation with a couple of different developers who have indicated their intent to request the use of property tax abatement from the city, which is not a tool that we have used in the past. We've used tax abatement, sales tax abatement and IRBs on a number of projects. Almost really every development project that has occurred, at least in my 18-year tenure here, but not the property tax. We've used TIF and CIDs and TDDs at various points in the past. So we had a tax abatement policy that was Council Policy 116, which is included in your packet, was drafted back in 2007. And there was a whole flurry. Basically, all of the city council policies were sort of created in a relatively short period of time. And I think it was the intent to just get something on the books so that if we were ever approached, we would have some guidelines. And then we haven't gone back to revisit because we haven't had that request. As we went back, as we started engaging in these conversations with a couple of the different developers about the potential use of tax abatement, we went back to look at our policy, and I don't think it aligns very well with sort of the current council's goals, values, objectives. So we have been working, I have been working with Mr. Heaven and Mr. Wimpy to look at policies from other cities and jurisdictions here in the metropolitan area to evaluate their policies. They both have a lot of experience with the use of this tool, and so it could kind of steer us towards policies that they felt perhaps were more effective or provided some more clarity. And so we've worked to get this draft policy in front of you tonight. But as we start tonight, I'm going to ask Kevin Wimpy with Gilmore and Bell to come up first. We have just, I think, 4 or 5 short slides about just what they are IRBs that would be issued. And the IRBs, you may recall from some of our other conversations, are always a little bit of a complicated, convoluted process. So we want to kind of just talk initially this evening about the tool itself. And then we'll talk a little bit about the process, kind of go a little bit different order than what we presented in the memo, but we'll kind of talk about the process and the timeline and how that works. And then come back and hope to spend the majority of our time kind of looking at the draft policy that we've put together that we hope has captured at least most of the things that we've heard you talk about as we've gone through those conversations. So with that, I would invite Kevin to come up and run through his slides, please.
All right, thanks, Laura. Good evening, Mayor, council members. Kevin Wimpy with Gilmore and Bell, the city's bond counsel. Nice to see you all again. Just a handful of slides really hitting the high points of IRBs and how they're used, and an overview of the process from beginning to end. So, are you? Oh, thank you. So on the next slide, then we'll dive in, just describing what are IRBs and going over the purposes and the incentives under which can be granted under the statute. I always like to start off and say that they're not a real financing mechanism. So most folks, when you hear bonds, think of when you borrow money to build a street or a public building. you're borrowing money from a third-party bond underwriter or purchaser and repaying over a term. I'll get to it a little bit later, but most IRBs under Kansas, the vast majority are what we call buy your own bonds, meaning the developer purchases its own bond and is solely responsible for payment of the debt service. And so that's why that first bullet point says it's an incentive granting vehicle. And the construction costs are privately financed by the developer. And the only purpose of issuing the IRBs is to grant one of two incentives or maybe both incentives. And those are property tax abatement for a term of up to 10 years under Kansas law. And I'll note that that's different in Missouri law, can go up to 25 years. So we're a little bit more limited on this side of the state line. Second is sales tax exemption on construction materials and furniture, fixtures, and equipment. I'll note there on the slide that since 2017, the school district's local levy for capital outlay, which is a maximum of 8 mills, is excluded or shielded from property tax abatement. All the other mills are eligible for abatement though. Pilots or payments in lieu of taxes are often imposed in relation to property tax abatement IRBs. And those can be imposed on what we call fixed dollar amount basis. So you agree on the front end to exact dollar amounts for years 1 through 10 of the abatement and ascribe a number to that. Or second, on the percentage basis. So for instance, 40% abatement for 10 years, meaning the property owner would pay 60% of what would otherwise be the full property tax bill. And the receipt of those pilots by the county then are distributed pro rata to all taxing jurisdictions. So just like other property taxes, they would go to all taxing jurisdictions that levy property taxes on the property pro rata. On the next slide.
Kevin, let me interrupt you there. Is
Sure.
that different than, how does that differ from what's negotiated potentially in a TIF agreement? Because you don't have a payment in lieu of taxes where that's statutorily required to go back to the other taxing entities, correct?
Right. So the main difference between TIF and IRB abatement is that in TIF, the full property tax is levied and paid by the property owner, but it's captured by the TIF fund. And there's different mills that are shielded. There's 29.5 total mills that are shielded under TIF. That's 20 base mills for the school district plus 8 mills for capital outlay. And then 1.5 mills for the state is shielded from TIF. And again, those property taxes are paid in full and then captured in the TIF fund and then can be used out of the TIF fund to pay for TIF eligible costs. On the other side, on abated projects, the property taxes are just never paid, or a portion of them are paid under a pilot agreement. So think TIF, the developer pays full property taxes, but they might be captured and reused for eligible costs. Tax abatement, they're never imposed, or just a portion of those property taxes are imposed. And of course, TIF runs for a 20-year period for a TIF plan, and under IRB abatement, again, it's just limited to 10 years. Okay, on the next slide under eligible projects, just real quickly, sort of reciting the statute, the variety of projects that can be financed with IRBs. Most typically we see warehouse or industrial manufacturing type facilities incentivized using this tool. Also multifamily development is eligible under the statute. And there's some specific, very specific carve outs under the statute in the sub bullet point there. And notably, you can't abate property taxes using IRBs that's within an active TIF project plan area. Finally, IRBs can be used for both new projects and remodeling. And one sort of extra bonus for a remodeling project is that sales tax is imposed on labor for remodeling projects. It's otherwise exempt for new projects in Kansas, you're probably aware. But IRBs can be for sales tax exemption can be a strong tool for renovation projects because it allows them to also exempt their sales tax on labor for the developer. Okay, the next slide, please. Basic structuring. The statute for IRBs anticipates and requires that the issuer or the city as the issuer of the bonds has a property interest. And so what that means is we install a base leaseback structure where the developer base leases the property to the city and it's simultaneously leased back to the developer. And the purpose of that financing lease back to the developer is that the lease payments are equal to the debt service on the bonds. The bonds are actually secured by those lease payments. And again, assume that this is what we call buy your own bond deal, meaning the developer holds its own bond. it's in essence through those lease payments and through the bond structure, paying debt service to itself on the IRBs. And I think included in your packet is the official Gilmore and Bell boxes and arrows that can be kind of confusing to look at, but it's an attempt to put on paper what the structure looks like. Key points at the bottom there is that city is in no way liable for a payment of IRBs. And in fact, the statute prohibits pledging full faith and credit behind our IRBs, and that there's no credit impact on the city. And finally, if there's an event of default or some sort of performance issue at the site, the bonds are simply terminated and the incentive ceases if we're still within that 10-year abatement period. All right, my final slide here is just a quick high level of steps. 1 through 6, there's all sorts of other things here, but these are the key ones, and I'll focus on the 2 bolded ones. I always call this a 2-step process at the council level. And the first step is number 3 on your sheet there. And it says that after the company's made application to the city, there's a cost benefit analysis prepared that's required under the state statute. And so a third party prepares that cost benefit analysis, taking into account projected effects on city, state, county, school revenues due to the abatement and the development anticipated at the project. There's also required notice to be published in the paper and also provided to the school district and county in writing. And then there's a public hearing held at the city council. And following all those steps, the council would consider a resolution of intent that expresses the city's intent to incentivize the project and issue the industrial revenue bonds. If the council would choose to take that step, the company would proceed with constructing the project, and the adoption of that resolution would allow the developer to access a sales tax exemption certificate with the state, and then can use that certificate to go purchase its materials and FF&E without paying sales tax. And then further down at step 5, this would be near completion of the project. The developer would return back to the council for step 2. And that would be consideration of a bond ordinance authorizing issuance of the bonds, execution of all the related documents to put in place that bond structure. And the reason there's a lag there with construction between those 2 steps is under the statute, that 10-year abatement period begins the calendar year after bonds are issued. And so developers in this buy your own bond structure wait till they're near completion. And that way, the following year, as the property is valued as of January 1, they're at or near full value. And that way they get 10 years of abatement while their project is out of the ground and fully valued on the tax rolls, rather than, for instance, issuing the bonds on day 1 when they're under construction, and perhaps their first year or 2, they're, quote, wasting a couple of years of abatement before the project's actually on the tax rolls. And final step there, the Board of Tax Appeals intervenes. There's an application made first part of the calendar year after bonds are issued to actually affect the abatement, and VOTA would issue an order effectively granting the property tax abatement. That's it for me. I'm happy to attempt to address any questions you might have. Yeah.
Yes, Ken?
You've had experience with this in other cities where this is being done, correct?
Correct.
During the hearing processes, have you participated or been at these hearings where they've, the county or the school district have responded to these hearings?
Not in an official capacity. There have been
Right.
elected officials who sometimes would show up to public hearings. It's open to the public. Another good distinction with TIF, though, is that with TIF, as I think this group's aware, the county and school district have an absolute veto right at the district creation process, where they can unilaterally shut down your project. That right doesn't exist in the IRB statutes. So while there's a public hearing and a notice process, it is fully at the city council's discretion. There's no other right for other taxing jurisdictions to formally intervene.
Have you seen any of the tenor of both the county as well as the school district in regards to this method of abatement?
I'm not sure, council member, I'm following the question. Thank you.
During the hearings, has the county officially taken positions on these types of abatements in the hearings that we should be aware of in terms of how the county views it or how the school district views it? I
don't think there's anything formal to communicate there. I think the other taxing jurisdictions like to have the information. So for instance, the cost benefit analysis that's required, that's usually part of the correspondence as you notify them about the public hearing, is providing that data to them so that they have visibility at about the project. I'm aware at the county Board of Commissioners meetings, that as part of their agenda, there's sort of an informational, here are the notices we've received from from our cities about development projects, and they're sometimes discussed. But I don't really have anything formal or any formal policy.
Okay,
things.
so there's not kind of like an aversion that's been historical with regards to these abatements.
Not at the institutional level from either the county or the school district, but I think what Mr. Wempe is saying, that you may have specific elected officials who may appear and express an objection to the use of the incentive tool.
Okay,
Mhm.
that's
That,
my,
yeah, I think
thank.
Yes, Debbie?
I appreciate what you've done because you've given me the what and the how.
Mhm.
And my question gets more to the basic foundation of the why.
Mhm.
And to look back, and I was on the council in 2007 when the initial policy was put together. And those criteria and factors are very instrumental, I believe, in getting us from 2007 to today. So I would like to you're still involved, but I'd like to understand from Laura's perspective, when you say some of the things don't mesh with the current values and mission of the city, I'd kind of like more information on that because I'm not grasping it that way at all.
Well, I think one of the things that I've heard, and it will apply to not only a new tax abatement policy, but I think we've also talked about, or at least the mayor and I have talked about, revisions that may need to happen to our TIF policy or any incentive policy that we have. So when you look at Council Policy 116, it really sets out, a threshold over which we would consider. So that it says final project greater than 25 million in value. Right. That was a really high threshold that we established at the time. I think if you look at some of the other policies that we've evaluated, that threshold can be much lower. And I think that's why as we move into talking about the draft of the policy, we've created kind of a tier or kind of a buy-up, right? Potentially. And so again, abatements for businesses that would compete directly with existing businesses will not be encouraged unless competing businesses have received or been offered similar incentives. That I think what we're seeing in our city and just in our 2.5 square miles is we're not looking to develop distribution centers or warehouse operations or other types of specific businesses that some of the other, Unified Government or Olathe, some of the other cities are doing there. So I think that we still have the discretion and flexibility to think about the impact of the use of any incentive tool on our existing businesses and kind of that equity issue, which I know Council Member Kring is one of your big, questions, and you have a lot of questions about precedent and, if we use this, what do we say to the next person kind of that comes along? So I think there's that. Well, that's one of the things we'll talk about later. The application and filing fee we've had in place in 1.03 in Council Policy 116. Those are really the statutory criteria to be used in that cost benefit analysis. So that would still be a requirement under this new policy. We're not losing that piece of it. Maybe have some different language around it,
These
which
are the ones I'm referring to that pretty much state
right.
what my stance.
And so that is a statutory. So the whole process, as Mr. Wempe, referenced, I think was step 2 in that process. So you make the application, then you move into the cost benefit analysis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of where we are in conversations or how that relates to the 2 developments that we have currently and the conversations that I've had to date with Mr. Kimmel and, as our financial advisor. No abatement shall be granted by the city, shall be transferred as a result or a change in ownership of the exempted property. I think we've built in some similar provisions in the draft policy to kind of look at that. So most of the things in here are some of the things that came just directly out of the statute. So there's steps regardless of what our draft policy says that we would have to follow. I think the things that we felt like we're missing are those things that you all have talked about that we feel like are important components, or the questions that we pose to developers, whether it's been an ask for TIF or tax abatement. So we've talked about affordable housing. We've talked about issues of sustainability. We've talked about other kinds of community benefits. And so we wanted to be able to at least have a conversation around a policy that incorporated some of those, so that, I mean, from our perspective as staff, anytime we're meeting with a new developer and they come in, we're communicating those things. But it also, I think, is helpful for us to be able to share a policy, and for you all, as you evaluate them, to be able to say, we have some clear sort of guidelines. So I think we tried to keep the important pieces of this in a new policy and add some additional layers that would be more reflective of what we're hearing you all discuss as a council at this time.
Yes, for example, Debbie, new section 1 in the new policy, which might be jumping ahead, gets to some of those goals and objectives, that we've talked about that weren't reflected in sort of just the resuscitation of the statutory factors, talking about diversifying the economy, attainable housing, et cetera. Yeah, Brent, then Ken.
Yeah, I guess if we're ready to jump into the new drafts, I did just wanted to ask a couple of questions. So in section 4, I see where we're.
Can I just pause there?
Sure.
And I want to talk a little bit more about some of the procedural things, because I think that will also then tie into some of the things that we talk about in process. So I don't know if Ken was a draft question or procedure question. Okay, so more policy.
Yeah, what I was wanting to have you talk about is how these thresholds were determined, and put it in perspective of the projects that we are looking at in terms of what would the threshold be in relationship to
Right.
Millhouse or
Right.
58.
So if you look at, and just as a point of reference, and I didn't include the TIF policy. So right now in our TIF policy, you have to be making a minimum investment of $5 million. So even in our own and current incentive policies, those thresholds are dramatically different, 25 to 5 million. And I can't remember what the CID policy says. We've looked at, so for example, the residents at Rock Creek or the Mission Bowl project is, so as we looked at other policies, there's also this question of final value versus capital construction costs. You'll see in our draft policy, we leaned a little bit more heavily on initial capital investment as opposed to final valuation. And that seemed to be more consistent with the other policies that we were examining. We could go either direction. And that's part of, as we started talking with the developers, the 58th and Knoll, John Moffett, or the Millhouse project, both of those projects we would anticipate would meet the threshold of final value of over 25 million. I think Moffat's project, Brian, and I didn't get around, I think he's probably capital construction 15 to 18 million. Yeah, so that 77 units, you're somewhere in that ballpark. So residents at Rock Creek, I think initial capital construction investment was somewhere in the neighborhood of somewhere between 25 and 30 million. And I would say Millhouse is probably in that same range as well. Does that answer? Okay. So just quickly, I want to run through some of the procedure and process issues. We've talked about a formal application. Neither of the developers have submitted that formal application at this time, in part because we wanted to make sure we had a new policy potentially in place and we could have an application that mirrored what was going to be important in the new policy. We would do that initial review of either the current projects or anything that would come along, in the future. And if it didn't meet the minimum criteria, then we just say to the developer at that point, it doesn't meet our minimum criteria, go back to the drawing board, or this isn't, we aren't going to take this forward.
Laura, can I just ask a quick question about that? If they do not meet the criteria and council votes against the tax abatement, do they get that money back for the application filing?
I don't know. We could probably not. I mean, it would depend on how quickly I think what we would do is we would have a pre-application meeting, and if their project doesn't meet it, we aren't even going to waste any time. I would say that probably we wouldn't refund it if we do any evaluation, because we're going to have some staff time and effort into the evaluation of that application.
And you also want to deter people from bringing just frivolous things that
Correct.
clearly don't meet the policy, right? Yeah.
And I think that's, I think that's where we run into some challenges now, because we know the things that the council is going to want to ask or look for in these projects, but the policy doesn't spell it out. And so there's sometimes this push and pull between staff, and we're saying, here's what you're going to hear when you take it forward to the council. So you should think through these things. And sometimes they believe us, and sometimes they test the waters a little bit more. But again, I think that's, that's part of that process. If we can clearly hand them something that says, we mean it, the council adopted this policy. And so, so there's a lot of back and forth that I think would still continue to happen up front. That cost benefit analysis, again, is required statutorily. That's a little bit different than kind of the but-for test. So there's still, and I will tell you that we've connected, for example, so, I'm not going to use the word, but the formerly known as the pre-development agreement. We haven't landed on the new version for that, but if it worked for Prince, I think it could work for this document. We have that in place with Moffett. So we've connected Moffett and his team with Bruce, and they provided some initial pro formas and looked at that. So Bruce will still do on any of these projects, we would anticipate an analysis that will kind of tell you, but for the use of any incentive tool, could a developer be expected to undertake the project? What's a reasonable rate of return? So there's that piece. Then there's also this cost benefit that goes through and talks about the job creation, some of those other economic benefits that will spill over potentially as a result of this project, as well as the implications for service delivery impacts on not only our jurisdiction, but the other jurisdictions. That's a piece in my conversations with Bruce that their firm doesn't typically do that cost benefit analysis, but he's provided me with information on a couple of different entities who do that very regularly. So that would be something that would also be done at the developer's expense, that we would move that forward. So that comes together, that cost benefit analysis that's required by the statute comes together with some of the similar analysis that you may have seen from Bruce on TIF projects, and all sort of feeds into your conversation and your decision making.
Yeah, Laura, so you're looking more closely at whether the final outcome, economic benefits of the project outweigh what you're giving
Correct.
in the tax abatement after any sort of not clawback, but after any sort of different agreement in the pilot, right?
So the impacts to the property tax base, your sales tax base, any other spinoff sort of benefits that, that you might have. So I think I saw Mayor Leah.
But it also looks at risks and costs to the community as well, like
Yes.
policing and schools,
Mhm.
all of that. Okay.
Yes.
Did you have more on process, or do we want to return
Just
to?
very quickly,
okay.
so I think a couple of things. Kevin covered pretty, I think clearly the notice to the taxing jurisdictions, the public hearing, the resolution of intent. I would ask either Kevin or Pete to sort of comment. One of the things we've talked about in putting the agenda packet together was that timeline, which I think we're all sensitive to, from when you approve something and when it starts to come out of the ground. And I think one or both of you shared something with me about that last week I'll look through my emails while we're continuing to talk about this. But then, so if you move forward with the project under tax abatement, so under TIF, we are familiar with redevelopment agreements that we negotiate that really becomes the contract between the city and the developer. We would have something similar in the case of a tax abatement, but it's called a performance agreement. And so again, that's where you're laying out all of the specific details of the abatement, the terms of the pilot, any and all other things. And then you move into that preparation of the bond documents, the issuance of the bonds, the submission to BOTA for final approval. And then there's an annual certification process that we have included where you just go back and you revisit, and is the project continuing to meet the objectives that were outlined when that when the incentive was granted. So I think that covers process unless anybody has some other questions, and then we can kind of jump into the policy.
Is it a process question or a substance question? Okay, yeah, go for it, Ken.
I don't know.
And then we'll go to Trent when we jump into the substance.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the clawback? Is that part of the process?
That would be something that would be included in, I mean, we've included that in the policy.
Yes.
It's communicating that up front, but that's not a requirement. That's something that we put in the draft policy because we think there's some merit to having the ability to claw back that benefit or a portion of that benefit based on certain criteria. But that's something, the specifics of which would be negotiated in a performance agreement.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, just to get a sense. It protects the city, I think, in
Yes,
even further.
yes.
So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, Trent?
I was just kind of curious why now for developers to kind of seek this route, is this process more cumbersome than TIF, considering the first 16 years, we didn't really get anybody pursuing this structure. I just didn't know if you had any theories on why that might be.
I have mine, but I'll let the two experts in the room who have a lot more experience. I think this is a tool that has been used. It's been used on this side of the state line by cities for quite some time. We haven't used it. I think has been in recent years more commonly used on the other side of the state line. And some of the developers that we've seen have done tax abatement projects. Millhouse, for example, has done tax abatement projects on both sides of the state line. So it's a tool they're familiar with and perhaps comfortable with, but I'll let Kevin or Pete kind of respond to the investment in the process from their perspective. I also think they think it has value to a certain extent. If, there's not that official veto. So if the city is supportive of the project, you don't have the school district or the county that has the ability to say no or to, put a stop to that. But
Who drew the short straw?
that appears that Mr. Hammond did.
Mayor, members of the council, Pete Heaven. One of the reasons people use IRBs is when the property is not TIF eligible. And under the Kansas statutes, your property has to be blighted or have a predominance of buildings 35 years or older. So many greenfield developers can't qualify for TIF. So IRBs are the next possible step. IRBs are not as good as TIF because they only last 10 years as opposed to 20. But IRBs have no restrictions on what you do with the tax money you've saved. With TIF, there are specific things you can use TIF money for, and they're very limited. With IRBs, the sky's the limit. So those are the basic differences, but it's primarily when the property can't qualify for TIF that we see IRBs.
And then Trent, did you have a question about a specific section of the agreement too, or?
Section 4, I guess, when we're ready for that.
Yeah, I think we're ready. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I know we've talked in the past on other initiatives about the merits of being as granular and specific about things versus more broad strokes in kind of our policy desires. I did in recent weeks become more interested in some of the alternative options that we've kind of floated as far as benefits to the city, in addition, beyond just LEED certification or attainable housing, things such as city beautification, land acquisition, green space, public art, those types of things. And I just didn't see any of those called out in this section and wondered if there might be room to consider, encouraging that sort of creative element to somehow for developers. So it's not just those two pieces, depending on what the project is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think as we kind of traded, drafts of this policy, there's some language that we could probably go borrow and tweak to fit our needs that suits more of that community benefit type piece. So we can certainly explore that further. I know, for example, in the city of Olathe's policy, there is a specific reference to their public art policy. We don't have that currently, so we could incorporate that here. Some of the other policies have some requirements to maintain a chamber membership or to provide sponsorship to a community festival, something along, those lines. So we certainly could add a provision here again in section 4 that would create some additional flexibility if, if the council were interested in that. And I think, so as we look at this policy, if you look at the policy statement. So again, tried to use a lot of language that is a disclaimer that makes it clear that this is always discretionary. It's never a given, but if you look at section 3, and this is something that was pretty standard in some of the policies that we looked at. So if you meet all the criteria, and the council is amenable to a project, many jurisdictions are setting kind of that floor, if you will. And we included that here at 45% abatement. So you would actually, this is the part that always confuses me, so that my cohorts in the back of the room. So again, 100% of the taxes are abated. You just manage that percentage through the payment in lieu of taxes. And then your other taxing jurisdictions, so whether it's the fire district, the school district, the county, they get that other portion of their dollars back. And so then you say, okay, so if we're interested in things more than just complying with the provisions of the cost benefit analysis, then we may want to allow for some greater abatement of taxes above that 45%. And that's why in section 4, we look at those things that allows a developer, the question there is, and I think what we really wanted to spend some time on this evening is, are there some other things that have to be met? Are there some other criteria which aren't discretionary? Because the way the policy is drafted currently, if you got over that cost benefit threshold and met some of those other objectives, and all you wanted was 45%, you could say, I'm not interested in affordable housing. I'm not interested in sustainability. I'm not interested in these things. That's part of what we wanted to have, the conversation with the council. Where do you want that to land? And I'll just touch on a couple of things. So minimum capital investment, we said was 3 million, which I think is actually the threshold that we have currently for sales tax abatement. But then in order to, and again, these are all flexible. We plugged in numbers here rather than leaving all of these blank for purposes of discussion. But then we said, in order to receive the maximum tax abatement, you would have the minimum capital investment would be 10 million. And then you can see in section 4A that the greater the initial capital investment, the potential is to then realize or capture a greater portion of that. So happy to, any of us, kind of walk through our thought process and putting some of this together, what we would like to see.
Okay, Ken, then Hillary.
On the recertification, annual recertification, is if something is not occurring to our liking in terms of the performance, is it possible to negotiate the percentage in a different direction? If we have a higher percentage than the minimum, is it possible to downgrade the percentage?
I think so, but having never done an annual certification on one of these projects, is that possible to adjust?
You could set the clawbacks at whatever you wanted, right? So if someone broke the goals, you could claw it all back or part of it back. You could set it. Is that right, Pete? You could structure it however you want.
What we generally see is if the property goes dark, for example, that would immediately terminate the tax abatement. There are other kinds of defaults that can occur. And in those cases, what we do, you have two variables. You've got the percentage of the abatement and you've got the term of the abatement. And so you use the clawback on the term side and you reduce the term, which then lowers the effective percentage. So, and you can do it either way, but that's how I typically see it. The clawback is you've done this and this and this wrong. We're going to cut you off 2 years or 3 years or whatever. And so your effective abatement goes down to 25%, not 45%. but anything can be done.
Yeah, we're gonna go to Hillary, then Leah.
We've talked a lot comparing this to TIF, and I know this is something we wouldn't have on hand tonight, but I'm wondering if it's not too much work for staff, famous last words there. If there's, yes, it is. I know you'd think I'd like to not have it on, but I'm wondering if there's a way that we could see some examples of either like a cost benefit from another city that's been done, or a comparison of even TIF versus this. I know it's apples and oranges and it's very different, but I think just having a better understanding of the application of some of this might help, at least for me. And if it's possible to come up with something like that, it would be helpful.
Yeah, Leah, or did you want to speak to that,
Let
Laura?
me speak to that because I think one, the first part, I think is probably pretty simple because I'm guessing that the cost benefit analysis is a matter of public record. So we could request that. And I'll put him on the spot, but I know that Mr. Wempe's firm actually negotiated the performance agreement with Millhouse for their project in downtown Olathe. So he's very familiar with one of the, I'm fairly certain we could probably get our hands on that cost benefit analysis. And so, yes, we could do that. And I think that is probably going to be something that's really good at illustrating the information that would be brought forward. I am still sort of finding my way in how to effectively compare that to a TIF. And you may recall in Millhouse, the most recent presentation we had from Devin Coffey of Millhouse, she, as part of that, was kind of started down the path of saying why we think TIF is or tax abatement is a benefit over TIF, and you're going to save $2 million. And the numbers in the context in which she was trying to present that didn't make any sense because you couldn't see the impact to the individual taxing jurisdictions, which is something that we would have to do. And that I think would be part of Bruce's analysis to really be able to see. And so if that's something, we can try to do some of that, but I think the tools are different enough. I think you're right. That may be a little bit difficult.
Yeah, I think just to follow up, I think the abatement feels very scary to some of us just because it's unknown. And I feel like just having some of it applied in comparison to something that's more familiar might help it, make better sense, at least in my mind.
Sure.
Yeah, Leah.
I think I found the answer to my question, but I just want to make sure. So the performance agreement would have all of those stipulations in which clawbacks could occur on that yearly assessment to make sure that everything's right. And then second of all, I just want to make sure I understand this, if the property is then sold within that 10-year time frame, the abatement does not go to the new person, the new owners pay full tax. Okay, just want to make sure I understand.
Well, it wouldn't automatically.
I think I don't think it automatically goes. I think that's discretionary. I know one of the things that has been in the news, I've seen a couple of things in the Kansas City Business Journal in the last year talking about the resale of projects. These were on the Missouri side where abatements were granted. And then there were significant profits that were made in that process of resale. And it's just a conversation around the incentive was granted because the project was expected to make less than a market rate of return for the developer. And then a few years into that, they turn around and, realize 20+%. There's been some criticism, at least in some of the articles that I've seen, that has said there ought to be an opportunity for the other taxing jurisdictions to be able to then recover some of that.
Yeah, and that's
abatement.
address Leah in 3F, which I think we might still need a little wordsmithing on that, Laura, because I think it still reads that they have to get our consent to sell the property, which isn't exactly right. They would have to get our consent for the abatement to transfer essentially. And that we could subject it to additional conditions or abatement adjustments. So if we had particular concerns about the new owner or things like that, you could, change those touch base criteria or make other changes to the terms. Yeah, let's go Debbie, then Ken.
I just need to understand, Mr. Wempe, your firm doesn't represent this Millhouse development, does it?
No.
Okay.
And you may want, yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have
Yeah.
drug you out in the road like that.
No, Councilmember
Right
Kevin
off the
Whitney with
bus.
Gilmore and Bell. Yeah, our firm only represents municipalities. We do not represent any developers.
So, but they drafted,
For Olathe drafted.
no, on behalf of the city.
City of
With the
Olathe.
city.
Yeah, Ken?
We've had consistent problems with developers who own property and do not keep up their property during the construction or prior to construction. Grass and do not maintain our codes, basically. Is there anything that we could do in terms of including something of that nature in terms of consistent compliance with our codes as a means to keep the performance in line with what we expect?
I see Pete nodding. Would that be part of the clawback criteria? Yeah, part of the performance agreement. Yeah. Yeah, Kristen? Microphone.
My question is regards to the affordable housing segment. It talks about using Kansas City, Missouri annual medium income. And I don't know, I mean, even KC Tenants doesn't like to go that broadly. I'm wondering why we're not using Mission AMI or even Johnson County AMI. I mean, those figures are easily available. And if there's a legal reason why we're looking at the Kansas City aspect of it.
Yeah, we could. I would guess. And we'd have to go back and look at the calculations that we did. I think we did some of that comparison when we looked at including that in the redevelopment agreement for the Mission Bowl project. And I actually think that at least from a Johnson County perspective, that's going to kick it, it's going to be higher than the Kansas City area. And if that's, I just want to be clear and understanding, you would like this, you would like to see, okay, I just want to be clear that you would like to see that be higher.
AMI is a number provided by the housing,
By HUD.
HUD, Housing Urban Development, and it's for the metropolitan area. So we say Kansas City, it's the entire Kansas City metropolitan area. And it's different than median income, which is confusing. It confused me at first when I was looking into all of this a couple of years ago. So AMI and median income are not necessarily the same number.
But it's a policy issue, so we can go ahead and we don't have to use Kansas City, Missouri.
Well, Kansas City AMI is Kansas City, Missouri, Johnson County.
Right,
Mission,
understood, but you know, you can go
Northland.
ahead and tighten up that demographic.
But there isn't a
Don't have
corresponding
the number.
figure available.
It's the same number. There's no specific number for Mission as opposed for Kansas City. It's all,
There, the census data has that information.
yeah, if we go to the state of Kansas, they'll refer us to Johnson County AMI, which is part of the metropolitan statistical area. So
I
it's
mean,
all
I
the
just
same
think it should
number.
be tightened up from a policy perspective here in Mission, which those figures are available. That's, I just want to be on the record for that.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah. I'm not aware if they're available, but if they are, I'd be curious to see that.
So I just want to be clear. So I think what I'm hearing you say is you want the income threshold to be higher, which would require people to earn more to qualify for the attainable housing units. Okay.
I don't like that as a policy option, but I don't know if we're vetting that out here tonight as we're going back for revisions, or if that's just a topic
No,
for
I
further
think it's just,
discussion.
I just want to make sure I understood.
Understood the position.
Yeah,
Okay.
understood that position.
Yeah, Ben?
So earlier you mentioned, asked if there are things that we would like to see more emphasis on or less discretionary. I think the attainable housing, the environmental design, sustainability pieces, I would like to be maybe put more emphasis on those, make those stronger, maybe not necessarily black and white requirements, but a larger sort of carrot involved with those pieces would be my preference. And I think on the environmental design, I don't want to box ourselves into just like LEED or similar certifications, but look at things like transit oriented development and mixed use and VMT reduction. Those are my thoughts on section 4.
So let me just ask for clarification. So from your perspective, perhaps giving larger abatement adjustments for those categories, attainable housing and environmental design,
Yes.
as
whether-
opposed to the ranges maybe on job creation or some of these other
And I think
categories.
I think those could be also larger, but certainly the attainable housing and the environmental design are the two that stick out to me.
But using that as a carrot to say, if you want to go up from that 45%, here are two easy categories, right?
Yeah, the case you made me think about was when you said somebody meets the baseline requirements for 45% and says, okay, well, that's fine. We don't want to do any of the rest of this. I'm not sure I want to give up that quickly.
Well,
That's
and you
all.
could
Yeah.
lower that and
Yeah.
have bigger carrots.
You could lower the baseline, you could,
Right.
I think,
or some combination. Yeah.
I think I think that was sort of the base that other cities, that was sort of the low end of the base of other cities, but we could take another look at that.
And then again, just making sure that that language is broad enough that we look at a variety of sustainability factors that, as you
Yeah, I
mentioned,
think
transit
there can be
oriented.
more to it than just the building itself. Certainly the cost
Yeah.
benefit analysis is definitely going to get into that, but I think you could score points for me at least on sustainability if you're building the right kind of development in the right place.
Yeah, and I think Laura too, we had some discussion about what made sense in terms of target area adjustment. And so maybe transit oriented development makes sense as another category there potentially, as well as distressed areas. But yeah, Trent and Ken.
Yeah, just on the note on to calling out, US Green Building Council and LEED certification, I think I've heard several developers now make comments along the lines of, oh, well, we're not going to do LEED because it requires you to, pay more to basically do what we already know we're doing or something. So it seems like they could always just skip that piece if we're giving them multiple avenues to achieve that component. So I don't necessarily have a proposal or anything up there, but if there was a way to somehow make it to where all options seemed appealing enough to where they weren't automatically going to rule one out and go for the cheapest option, based on everything we're spelling out. I don't know quite what that would look like with words, but that's just.
I think we have to close the circle on the energy efficiency codes.
Yeah, I was just gonna
Yeah.
say, there's another way to also get at that sustainable build, at least the building envelope and the building structure aspect, in addition to these other requirements in a performance agreement like this.
Yeah, Ken.
I thought that we had, the Sustainability Committee was going to be doing some of the comparisons where they got those two different.
I think that was something staff was looking at in terms of trying to find, it's hard, my understanding is it's hard to find a reliable third-party resource on the differences between LEED and green globes, or what's the other residential one? Green buildings or something. There's a third one that people have brought up.
No, I think the Green Globes is,
There was a third one that some
national-
developer brought up,
The
but yeah, I
So
think sorting through those differences.
sorting
is
through that,
tricky.
and again, I think the mayor's correct. I think.
The other thing that I was wanting to bring up is in some of these apartments like Mill House and the one that we're doing up on Metcalf, we talked about retail services for the community. I mean, having availability of retail at the floor level. I know that that's part of our form-based code design. Is there something that we can include in that as part of the features that we're looking for? I know it may not be feasible for a 58 apartment building, but trying to encourage, and I'm not trying to encourage competition with existing businesses, but I am trying to find a way that we can increase community services.
Yeah, and I think that's where exclusive from a tax abatement policy, you have zoning requirements. Right, so in MS2, MS1, mixed use, you're going to have some of those components there as well. They can request a deviation, but it's not specific to that. I would also say that as it relates to an incentive policy, being able to incorporate some of that retail is going to probably bump up a cost benefit score, because you're going to be able to talk specifically about some at least limited amount of job creation associated with a project. Or that impact on property tax base or particularly sales tax base. Would take on a different flavor than just looking at like a 58 and all where you're trying to estimate the sales tax impact throughout the community of 77 new apartment units and the residents that live there. So I think there's some ways that those work together, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, Ken?
The other thing is looking at Millhouse specifically, we have two elements that they're trying to argue is beneficial to the city. One was the switching of Beverly Park location and swapping of land. I'm not sure that that's really a benefit to the city. I mean, I don't know how you measure the benefit component of that. That's one question. I mean, yes, maybe the playground equipment and things like that they're offering. The other thing that they're arguing is that the transportation, that moving the bus stop from the community center over to in front of their building, to me, that's a convenience for their residents. It's not necessarily a benefit to the city. So I don't know how they're arguing that that's beneficial to the city.
Well, I think it's always interesting to hear the developer's perspective when they present to you all, or they present to us about what they perceive to be benefits. But I would go back and sort of deconstruct both of those in a little bit. And I think I'm going to sound like Councilmember Chosey maybe a little bit, but I think that initially they brought forward a plan that was it exceeded the height limitations, right? So it's going to require some deviations. And we actually engaged with them at the staff level to say, what options do you have, right? So we know there are some height concerns. And what if you were able to pick up these blighted properties across the street that that the previous developer has not been successful in getting that project done. So I think we have to look at community benefit, maybe going back to Councilmember Boltinghouse's point. Community benefit is a little, I think, as broad as we want it to be, or can look at it to say, is there a community benefit to a project which also addresses some challenging properties in a way that we know may be more palatable to adjoining neighbors? And is that a benefit? Is that an appropriate trade-off? And in order to do that, we need to think about that, that land swap, because it allows them to have, a better design of the building without carving out that little piece. And then effectively, if you think about it, if you left, they showed us some designs initially in that project that had the Beverly Park carved out. Well, if you have a 5-story building that surrounds 3 sides of this Beverly Park, is that desirable green space, right? So we've long talked about wanting to have some sort of connection between the community center and, so I think I would maybe set aside all of the arguments that you might just be hearing or taking at face value what you're hearing from the developer. And we really need to delve into those and dive into those and say, what does that mean for us from a big picture perspective about the benefits that we might realize?
That's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah. And it is a little down a rabbit hole, but just very briefly, many of the residents at Mission Square hate where the bus stop is and feel like it's unsafe. And so there've been concerns about sight lines.
Well,
and
Celia will
various
tell you the
things.
sight lines aren't
Yeah,
appropriate.
Celia agrees with them on that point. The sight lines are bad.
Here. Yeah, you have to come up.
We're actually working with transit because so the bus stop isn't actually in the way. It's that long, what do you call it? The big blade that sticks up. So they're going to take that down. Then they'll be able to see there. But my concern of moving it over by there is I think you're going to have a sight distance issue trying to get around the corner. So I don't know that we've been talking internally. I don't know that that's going to work for them to move it over. So.
Yeah, we may just say no, thank you. They're gonna throw everything, again, kind of, they were trying to make the argument, the tax abatement is so much better than TIF. And, they want you to approve their project, so they're gonna paint it in the best light.
Oh, Debbie, yeah.
I would just go back just a little bit and I'd ask this governing body to understand what authority you have to say no to things. You have the utmost authority and you have an obligation to the people that you represent to say yes, no, or have additional questions on this project. I have nothing against apartments. I don't. I wanted a traffic study because I think you get an influx of traffic and people are going to want to know, how am I going to get out on the street? It's hard. There's traffic problems. I think eventually we're going to have to add police. You can't keep adding people and not think it doesn't impact the staff. It does. I'm not trying to be emotional. I'm trying to be real cut and dry. You have an obligation to the people that voted for you to do what's in their best interest. They are the community. And if you haven't talked to your constituents about this, I very rarely would accept the fact that 90 of 100 of them would stand up and say, yes, give them a tax abatement. I pay my taxes and I have to. If I do home improvements, I pay sales tax on that labor and those services. Think about the people that voted for you and what their expectation is. I certainly am going to do that. Thanks.
Yeah, Debbie, I would just push back on that a little bit. I think it's a little disingenuous to suggest that that opposition to tax abatements or opposition to apartments is the only position from which a council member could be supporting the community or their constituents. And I think we know each other well enough and have worked together well enough to know that, you know, I have faith that everyone on this governing body is trying to do what they think is best for mission and for their constituents. And I don't think to suggest otherwise is entirely fair to this group or what we've been able to do.
I think it goes back to some of the things we've talked about in past retreats, and that is, you know, we think about what tools we have in our toolbox as a city to encourage and promote economic development. Sometimes we forget about the use of these incentives is maybe bringing that economic development to support our residents and, you know, broaden a tax base or do some other things. So I think it's absolutely a balancing act, which is why I think you have to go through that cost benefit analysis and you have to really be thoughtful in saying, you know, would this development happen, right? Would this development happen without the use of these incentive tools? And I think we really do, you know, drill down on that. But we look at how long some of these properties have remained vacant in our community. And what's, you know, what's that threshold as well? I think that's part of that evaluation that, again, as the mayor said, I know every one of you goes through as we talk about and evaluate these things.
Well, and I know we don't have our side by side that Hillary requested yet on the tax abatements versus the TIF, but that is one thing, as I kind of dove in on the different policies, that I really like about the tax abatement is having that more explicit third-party expert cost benefit analysis, because that's what you're doing on a TIF when you're exercising your discretion on, do I think this is a good deal overall? But the only thing you're really seeing the numbers on in the TIF is that but for case. And so it could be a project that needs help, but that we don't think is overall a benefit to the community. And it would technically, you know, meet the minimum threshold for a TIF, but that sort of project is going to fail a tax abatement because it's not going to have that overall, the benefit's not going to outweigh the cost. But yeah, Ken?
I'd like to also hear a little bit more about the use of this means for remodeling existing buildings, because we have a lot of dated buildings, and how can we not only incentivize new construction, but renewing some of the construction that we have? Can somebody
I don't know, I'm hopeful.
discuss that a little bit?
I don't have any experience with that, so. Yep, Kevin drew the short straw.
Good question, council member. And I touched on it briefly in the slides, but essentially the IRBs for sales tax abatement carry a little more weight for renovation projects. Because under separate statute, completely separate from IRBs and incentives, labor on new construction is exempt in Kansas. For some reason, it's not for renovation projects. So a lot of times we see developers requesting sales tax exemption IRBs for renovation because labor, we always ballpark about half the cost of the project. It wavers a little bit, but carries that added benefit that they can exempt labor for even renovation projects using this tool. And in addition, obviously, any of their construction materials, furniture, fixtures, and equipment and so forth could be exempted using sales tax. If you're thinking property tax abatement for renovation, that occurs as well, because an eligible cost for IRBs is the acquisition cost. So if one property has been left vacant or, unoccupied and a new entity comes in and wants to purchase the facility and invest new dollars in that facility. Part of the capital cost could be that company, the second company who's acquiring, their cost to acquire and also renovate and bring the property online could be eligible.
Is that something that's could be more explicit in this policy?
And I'm going to go into territory that I don't know much about, but I would think that you want to use this tax abatement policy for larger scale projects. And it's my understanding, we've talked about it. I think Councilmember Crane was probably the only person that was on the council the last time we talked about neighborhood reinvestment areas. So that's another tool that can be used in both residential and commercial areas. So if there is something that we would want to look at, I mean, we did some research many years ago, and we didn't have any real clear-cut goals around how we might want to use that or sort of target areas. But I would think that a neighborhood reinvestment area might be better for a smaller type business, and again, you can designate those areas in either residential or commercial. So I think it's scale of project as it relates to this, and I don't think you want to muddy those waters in this policy. I think you want this to say, again, because I think getting over that cost benefit threshold for a smaller remodel project is probably much more difficult than a new big redevelopment project.
Yeah.
The sales tax exemption for that dentist office on the southeast corner.
Yes.
Is there a minimum, either investment that a developer has to put in for that sales tax exemption segment of the IRBs?
I don't think so, but is there a council policy manual behind you, Mayor, in that bookshelf?
We don't need to go to that extent.
Well, I don't know. And I think when we were looking for that, I don't think there is for.
There's codes, but not.
Okay,
Access to
I'll look that up. But I
library.
mean, that's one of the things that we've been talking about, do we want to create that threshold? I don't think we have one. I mean, I think we probably used the $3 million number, which exists in one of our incentive policies. I think maybe the CID policy. But no, we don't have I don't think a firm number that we've used for that.
That's cool, thank you.
Ben, did you have a question? And then I have a question for Kevin, and then we'll go to Leah.
I am also really interested in the redevelopment and renovation. It strikes me as a unique set of challenges that even this policy is, we'll have trouble anticipating all the different things we could get into. But in general, I find myself thinking a lot when we have this conversation about existing properties that we probably need to figure out a way to be more proactive about. I don't know, not necessarily thrusting these options upon property owners, but at least helping them sort of realize these tools exist and take advantage of them, because I think in a lot of ways, these properties that have sat around and not had a lot of TLC for a long time, I don't think it's probably just not something that comes to mind to say, hey, I should go get a tax abatement or a TIF or whatever and do the whole block of Johnson Drive. I mean, I think we need to maybe be more proactive on looking at existing properties and what the vision could be and how we could work with those property owners to spruce things up or revitalize a block or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the city has historically been creative. When Target was redeveloped, there wasn't a tax abatement or a TIF that was used, but there was an incentive that was granted to Target for the remodeling of that building. And one of the conversations was that, okay, if we're giving this incentive for this larger big box retailer that's coming in, what are we going to do? And so for a period of time, I think it was until there was equal to the amount of the incentive given to Target, sort of sales tax revenues generated by that store were set aside and basically created the Business Development Corporation, or MBDC, and the Business Improvement Grant Program. And so that's how the business improvement. So I think that that's a common theme, at least in my tenure here, that we've heard. And I think we have ways to do that to really help and think, because I do think that the things that will incentivize or best support kind of our mom and pop businesses along Johnson Drive are very different than some of these other larger scale projects that we're gonna look at.
Yeah, I see us put a lot of time and energy into land use planning and I wonder if it would go even further if we were able to say, you know, we'll put some dollars behind this, even if you, if you want to step up and try to meet us there.
I had a question I think would be for Kevin. It might be a little too in the weeds, but if we're talking about for use for existing projects, are there certain categories where if you've already received funds, like for example, at the state level, I'm thinking about some of our large multifamily projects in particular, that you then wouldn't qualify for IRBs? Like I know it was mentioned, if it's already a TIF district, you can't do the IRBs. Are there other things with state level bonds or other programs where you can't do the IRBs? It's okay if you don't know that off the top of your head.
No, and I looking at, nothing, no prohibitions come to mind other
Okay.
than what's sort of recited in the statute. And the first one I thought of, because we were talking about Johnson Drive and retail, is that one of the specific carve outs from property tax abatement is for I usually just refer to it as general retail, but it's under the insurance code sections 44 and 45. So to get into the weeds, but
Okay.
generally it prohibits property tax abatement for retail, but you can still use sales tax exemption IRBs for those things.
Okay, great.
I
And
think we did learn, in some recent conversations that if they have IRBs that are outstanding, like housing bonds or other IRBs that were
Yeah.
issued, the bonds would have to be paid off. The prior bonds would have to be paid off before new
Before new
bonds could be
bonds.
issued.
but that's similar, that's bonds on bonds, kind of. Okay. And then my other question was, and I know we've kept you hopping, Laura, so that you probably don't have the answer, but I am very concerned about the timeline piece and the idea that we're granting incentives for a particular moment in time. And so if we grant the incentives and then the project isn't completed for like 8 years or whatever, that may or may not mesh with why we granted incentives. So what can we do in this policy or elsewhere to sort of prevent that problem and kind of make sure we're capturing, the moment?
And, Laura, I think you looked at us for that. I think the item to address there is recalling the timeline slide where it had the 2 council steps bolded. A lot of times what we would do is in that resolution of intent where this group would consider, whether the incentive would be granted or not, is have some sort of expiration date in that resolution. That can take any form you'd like. A lot of times in communities, it's based on, the IRBs have to be issued within so many years, usually taking the construction timeline. For instance, if they had an 18-month construction timeline, we might give them 2 years to issue the bonds. And if bonds aren't issued in that timeline, the resolution lapses. Does that answer your question? Is that what okay, I'm sorry.
Brilliant. Okay,
I
thank
knew
you.
there was some question about timing and expiration, and that's,
Yes.
that's exactly what you said.
So
said
you would build it in.
The resolution of intent has an
Okay.
expiration date.
Leah, I think you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to, remind everybody that, Johnson County has a substantial housing crisis. There is not enough housing and that's what's really driving up the cost. And if you look at Mission in particular, in 1990, we had a little under 5,000 people living here. We're now almost to 10,000. So that's a huge amount of growth. I think that we could handle even more. And we know that, making more people live in or allowing more people to live in Mission is going to be great for our downtown, for lots of other things, and getting rid of those little Pizza Hut buildings. I mean, come on, they've been sitting there forever, not doing anything but growing weeds. So I think that, this is a good opportunity to realize a couple of different goals that may be worth a 10-year tax abatement as opposed to a 20-year tip.
I think it's important to note that you have the opportunity to play, it can be anywhere from 0 to 100% and anywhere from 1 to 10 years. So you have opportunities, as I think Mr. Heaven was referencing on the clawback piece, but you can also on the front end sort of control for the amount of that incentive in 2 different ways, either through percentage or length of time that's granted. I did want to just touch on one thing that we included in here. So right now we have a separate policy, and I don't know the council policy number off the top of my head, where we talk about the fees related to the issuance of any bonds for private development activity. I think I always have to call somebody and ask them to interpret it anytime we're trying to figure out what that is. And as we were reviewing other cities' policies, I liked the fact that they incorporated the fee structure into that policy. So if the developer was looking at it, you went to one place and you could sort of clearly understand. And so the tables included in here are intended to do just that. If we move forward with something like this, we would look at probably eliminating or that other additional city council policy. But the other thing that we did here, and this is something that we took, I don't remember which city's policy, city of Lenexa, I think. Because I think there's been some question about, what type of project do we want to incentivize? But as you can see, like the fee structure for a multifamily project is higher. So the developer is going to pay the city more to issue IRBs on a multifamily project than they would on a purely commercial project, for example. So that's another way to think about how do you want to incentivize the type of development that you want to see.
Yeah, Trent?
I don't know if this question is tied to what you just said, but I was just thinking about staff time specifically at the front end of processing these applications. You think about if I have a developer proposing like a $5 million project versus a $20 million project, those are two different lifts for staff to do. And is there a way to somehow, tie in the amount of heft that the project will require to the fee? And is that what you're saying this does? No.
So if you go to section 7 C costs. So you pay an application fee up front, covers kind of our preliminary look at things typically. It shall be the responsibility of the applicant to reimburse the city in full for all costs and fees associated with the economic analysis and bond issuance, including an application fee of blank. So sort of cover all of those analysis costs, which is going to be scalable, right?
Well, my question was, is it
It's separate from
appropriate
the
to
fees.
have an X dollar amount? Because won't that dollar amount be technically more if you're like, even your initial, like, should we just say it's like, just throwing out a number, like 1% of the total amount that the cost is or whatever?
So it's hard. I mean, I think there are a variety of things that can contribute to even on a smaller scale project. So depending on how sophisticated the financial data may be, it
Okay.
may take more time.
Oh.
Than it's somebody who's maybe more experienced in doing this. So I think as long as you're just saying you're obligating the developer to cover all the costs and we recoup whatever we have invested in our staff time, that's always a little, sort of gray. We don't usually calculate that. But most of that time is spent with bond counsel, with land use attorney, with financial advisor. So we cover that. Then in addition, what these two tables in the policy show is once you get to that bond issuance stage, based on the amount of bonds to be issued, you're basically generating additional fees.
So are you saying that that
Revenues.
verbiage will cover inflation? If we're saying $2,500 today, in 10 years, that's not going to be the same amount, but we'll still get covered. Okay.
Mhm. And we can always adjust. You can go back and adjust, over time. And that's the thing. I mean, we haven't touched the current tax abatement policy for, since 2007. This is something that if we have, I think, we come back, we revisit it. We think, the mayor made the comment at this moment in time, in 5 years, we may be looking at completely different set of circumstances or things, challenges or opportunities for the community. And we may want to go in and revise this policy and have it reflect, where we are at that moment in time.
Any other questions for any of our team? I don't,
Just
Ken, do you
a
have
comment.
something?
I just want to say this has been very helpful. I really appreciate the input from all of you in the process. It's very informative.
Thank you. Well, I think next steps, we do have a couple of people who are anxious we've been holding them off. So I think what I would recommend, I don't think we can probably turn around changes for committee meetings next week. But to look at sort of incorporating some of the things we've heard this evening into a new draft policy and try to get that back in front of you as soon as we can. Work with the mayor to schedule that appropriately.
Yeah, question from Debbie.
Is it possible to look at potential code enforcement on the property at 58th and Knoll because there's grass growing way up? It looks terrible. I
And
mean,
same with the Pizza Hut buildings.
Pizza Hut buildings.
Do you know if we've issued notice of violation?
I got an email from the developer late last week that they had mowed the lawn at 58 and all. So that should be taken care of. And it seems like they've been keeping up with the grass at the Pizza Hut buildings, but yes, the bushes are outgrown, very, very overgrown.
Yeah.
Maybe part of the new park.
All right, anything else? Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.